Saturday, August 18th, 2018, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I'd like to talk about Ron Paul, the Fed, Big Pharma. I know that's not a subject I usually touch upon, but I saw a little, not an article, but like a brief mention of something that happened in Italy in this magazine here, The Economist Globalist magazine, and it made me want to talk about it. Big Pharma. I think even though I always talk about how the banking system is corrupt, how we need to reform banking and the Fed, I think pharmaceutical companies are almost, if not just as bad as banking. And the reason I don't touch upon it, because I cover more economics, but in this case I need to touch upon it. And I'll also look at a couple of charts of the Brazilian currency, the Brazilian real, and the Turkish lira. I think they're still pointing to big troubles ahead, not just for those countries, but maybe for the world financial system. And why do I say that? Well, because if you put together the Brazilian economy and the Turkish economy, they're bigger than, for example, the UK economy. The Brazilian economy is bigger than the Italian economy. So I think it's something we need to look at. So first of all, let's start with Ron Paul. A lot of people, I've done book reviews recently. Yesterday I talked about one of Eustace Mullen's book. And someone said, well, why don't you talk about End the Fed? And I do sell End the Fed merchandise in the Monaco 64 store, which you can find a link to below in the description. And I do have Ron Paul's End the Fed book, which I bought when it came out around 2009, 2010. It's a classic. You need to read that. And Ron Paul. The other interesting point about Ron Paul is that I've actually met him. I'm not trying to be a name dropper or anything. I went with my wife in 2002 when I started looking into the system, into the Austrian School of Economics, when I started investing in gold, when I was looking at free markets, freedom. We decided to go to the Mises Institute 20th anniversary in Auburn, Alabama. So we flew from London to Atlanta, and then we were shuttled to Auburn for the Mises Institute anniversary. And there's a conference. There's, I think, 2 days of lectures. You could go anywhere you wanted to listen to different economists, listen to Ron Paul. I think he spoke in the last day at a luncheon outside. It was really nice weather. There was a dinner one of the days. And Ron Paul, he attended some of the lectures, and I went up to him, introduced myself, and talked to him. Very nice gentleman, Ron Paul. And we started speaking about Alan Greenspan, who was the Fed chairman at the time. And as most of you probably know, Ron Paul was on the Congressional Committee, the Monetary Economic Committee. I forgot exactly the name, but he used to always be there when Greenspan was testifying, or the Fed chairman, whoever it might be. And he used to ask him really difficult questions. And I asked him, because we were speaking also about the essay that Greenspan, or article that Greenspan wrote in 1966, Golden Economic Freedom. And Ron Paul told me that he went up to Greenspan after one of the testimonies, and he had a copy of the essay, and he asked Greenspan to autograph it, and he did. And he actually asked Greenspan, do you still believe in everything you said about golden economic freedom? He said, no doubt I do, more than ever. And Ron Paul was like, wow. But then Greenspan told him, well, I do believe in it, but the thing is, the public needs to believe in it. The politics is not conducive to it. Greenspan was saying, the members of Congress can still be bought out by the people who control the Fed. So that was my meeting with Ron Paul in 2002. He was a lone voice back then. I would never have imagined back then that he would have become so popular in 2008. I think he should have been the candidate. I think the fake mainstream media, I remember during the primaries, he was doing really well. Sometimes he'd win a primary, and they come out with the results, and they have Mitt Romney on top, and then they'd have Ron Paul just underneath, and even though he'd won. So and you could see all the when Ron Paul was campaigning, you had thousands, tens of thousands of people listening to him. I even think at one of the campuses in California, one of the universities, it had 20,000 students. And then you look at the Romney rallies, there's almost no one. So they were successful, unfortunately, in snuffing out Ron Paul's message. Hopefully his son, Rand Paul, will be able to carry the torch. I think he's a good guy, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. I listened to an interview he did yesterday, I think, on Ron Paul's website, YouTube channel, the Ron Paul Liberty Report. I highly recommend that channel. Hopefully it will still be up on YouTube for a while because as we know, they're censoring alternative voices. So what about the book and the Fed? Of course, I'll put a link below to it in the description. If you want to buy it, you might find it also for free on PDF. But so what does Ron Paul say here? I'll take a few snippets. He says, the Federal Reserve System must be challenged. Ultimately, it needs to be eliminated. The government cannot and should not be trusted with a monopoly on money. No single institution in society should have power this immense. In fact, I believe that freedom itself is at stake in this struggle. I totally agree with him, and that's why I keep going on about central banks. What else? Yeah, towards the end here, what does he say? Well, this is like in 2009, 2010, so we've got a long way to go. This is how it concludes the book. What is left, and I quote, what is left for us to do? The future looks bleak. The power elites are hunkering down, and there's no sign that anyone in Washington cares, listens, or understands the issue of money and the power of the Fed. I haven't really heard Donald Trump talk too much about that. So let's hope he does. And he goes on to say, does that mean our only option is to go into survival mode? I don't think so. There's a rumbling in the heartland. The anger is building. Well, this was in 2009, and he was right. That's what the Trump election of Trump was all about. He carried the heartland, Ohio, states, Pennsylvania, a lot of states that he was not supposed to, right? But we still haven't heard Trump really criticize the institution of the Fed. He's criticized policy. Harnessing that anger and converting it into positive and constructive energy could have favorable consequences beyond our imagination. It's time to become energized, not despondent over the tragic mess that has been imposed on us. So yeah, I agree with him. We just need to keep exposing this corrupt, fraudulent monetary system. So that's the end here. This is what he says. If the freedom movement continues to grow as it has these past 2 years, I would say there's plenty of room for optimism. Freedom and central banking are incompatible. There you go. It is freedom we seek. And when that precious goal is achieved, the chant "End the Fed" will become a reality. That's why it's important that we keep going on about the Fed and ending it. So what about Big Pharma? What do I want to talk about? Well, as I said, I bought The Economist earlier this week. I was reading through the section where they just summarize what's going on, and I even highlighted it, and I'll read. Italy's Senate voted to overturn legislation that requires all children to be vaccinated against measles. Some, and, and it said, this is the Globalist magazine, right? It says, some in the ruling coalition believe anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. The measles virus is highly contagious. So even though the Italian Senate voted to overturn this legislation, they come out and say, oh, don't forget, some of these people are conspiracy theorists. And they don't even tell you why. They just use the term conspiracy theories. So what about Big Pharma? Well, one of the things about Big Pharma, it's the only industry in the US that is not, they're immune to court cases. They have no liability. I think there was one law, one act of Congress under Bush Sr. that was passed in the late 80s that did that. And now they have no pharma liability against vaccines. So there you go. There's an article here on nvic.org, and it says no pharma liability, no vaccine mandates. So it goes on to say, on February 22nd, 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court shielded drug companies from all liability for harm caused by vaccines mandated by government when companies could have made a safer vaccine. From now on, drug companies selling vaccines in America will not be held accountable by a jury of our peers in a court of law if those vaccines brain damage us but could have been made less toxic. If you get paralyzed by a flu shot or your child has a serious reaction to a vaccine required for school and becomes learning disabled, epileptic, autistic, asthmatic, diabetic, or mentally retarded, you are on your own. So, and it goes on to say Big Pharma blackmailed Congress in 1982. And I'll read again. It says, to understand how this happened, we have to turn back the clock to 1982. This is when the four big drug companies, Merck, Wyeth, Lateral, Connaught, blackmailed Congress by threatening to stop selling vaccines in America unless a law was passed giving them complete immunity from prosecution. And I think it was later on when George Herbert Walker Bush was elected in '88. After that, they got what they wanted. And that's why I remember, because I was in the States in the 80s, went to university there, and I remember at the time on television, a lot of the advertising on television was about fast food, Burger King, McDonald's, or whatever, and or Wendy's. Where's the beef, right? You remember that old lady, where's the beef? But then when I started my career in the city and used to travel to New York sometimes on business in the mid-late 90s, I noticed a lot of the television adverts were about prescription drugs. And I thought, what the hell's going on? Why all these? And now I understand, because the Big Pharma has been given a big green light. So you can do anything you want. You're immune from prosecution. And that's what's happened. And now, the thing about autism is that the people who are against these vaccines, they're not against vaccines per se. And I've done my homework on this for many years, and I'll explain that a little later. The thing about these vaccines is that they put these pharmaceutical companies, they want to make a lot of money, a lot of profit. So what they have done is they've combined a lot of the children's vaccine. They put them all together, and to do that, they need to use mercury or thimerosal to preserve these vaccines. If they gave the children one vaccine at a time, they wouldn't make as much money. So it's not the vaccines themselves that have led to reactions by children. It's the mercury. Mercury is poison. And they're injecting that into babies. So that's what it's about. But anyone who, even doctors who mention this or do research on it, like Dr. Wakefield in the UK. They stripped him off of his license to be a doctor in the UK. He's had to go to the States. And that's the other thing I wanted to talk about, the fact that they've stripped InfoWars from all the social media, YouTube especially, because I have to give Alex Jones credit. He brought Dr. Wakefield on 8 years ago. I don't remember exactly when he was stripped and he had to move to the States. And he gave him a platform, and that's how I got to learn about these things. But now if you go on YouTube and you try to find something, an old video about this, you won't be able to, and that's really bad. So why am I talking about this? Well, I remember my daughter, she was born in 1996, and my wife always tells me, and she told me at the time, but when she was 3, my daughter, she was in nursery, and the nursery contacted us and said, well, Annabelle is showing some signs, some funny signs of autism, and my wife and I are like, well, what's going on? So my wife took her to the GP or the doctor, and she told her what happened, and she said, oh, don't take the vaccines anymore. So my wife, at the time, we didn't think anything. Okay, don't take the vaccines anymore, but why? So there's an example. Thankfully, my daughter didn't get any worse, but it could have been worse. And some people also talk about how Hollywood is in the pocket of a lot of big corporations and the power elite, how they make movies to condition you. And I would have to say that the movie Rain Man is one of these. It was back in 1988 they made this movie with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise about this autistic guy and his brother. And at the time, it was a great movie, but no one had heard of the term autism. And now it's like every other child has some kind of autism. They call it spectrum disorder. Not every other, but it's a lot. It's like an epidemic. So could they be, did they know this? Were they preparing us for this? And this was right around the time when Big Pharma got its blank check from Congress. So, yeah, banking, yeah, we need to end the Fed, reform it. But Big Pharma, wow, this is just, and everyone who tries to question it is a conspiracy theorist. So we've got guys like Bobby Kennedy, right? Donald Trump has talked about that, conspiracy theorist. The Italian Senate is voted against making vaccines, how can I say, mandatory for children in Italy. Oh, they're conspiracy theorists. So, and yeah, this is coming from the globalist Rothschild magazine, who probably own the majority of the pharmaceutical companies, right? So now back to the charts. I wanted to talk about the markets, and I said I'd cover the Brazilian real and the Turkish lira. The Brazilian real, I've looked at the chart here, and it's yes, from 2002, and look how this is like a teacup, very bullish, and this is in terms of how many reals you can get for the dollar. So the higher this chart goes, that means that the real is going down the dumps. And you saw there's a spike there to all-time highs in October 2015. And I remember being in Brazil. That was the last time I was in Brazil when that happened. At the time, I thought this is overdone. And it was, because we went back down. But now it's going back up, and it's forming the handle of the teacup. And what could trigger all this? Well, all the trade wars already are triggering weaker emerging market currencies. Lower commodity prices doesn't help Brazil. And plus now, in October, we have a general election in Brazil, which could be really historic, because the guy who's leading the polls is in jail, and we don't know if he's going to run, and the other guys are not popular at all. So that's the Brazilian real, not looking good. You can see that the 4 level is very important. I think the all-time high is just below 425. The Turkish lira, we know what's going on there. I covered it in the last week or so. It had come back down, the dollar, so the lira recovered a bit, but yesterday it actually closed above 6, and it's still not looking very good. The chart is very different from the Brazilian real one. It's more of a, it looks like it was more of a controlled devaluation of the currency, and now it's like gone through the roof. So these two countries could put, how can I say, the whole world financial system in jeopardy. And I haven't even talked about Italy. And we have the budget coming out in Italy next month. We've got the Italian 10-year yield already back above 3%, almost at recent highs. And we've got the globalists also trying to discredit the Italian government because they're doing things like overturning laws that force people to take their children to take, force adults to make their children take vaccines. So they're not playing the globalist game. I know the video has been a bit long today, but it is the weekend and I needed to talk about these things. So if you enjoyed it, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. And if you do subscribe, click on the little bell so you get notified of my new videos. You can also follow me on Twitter, DTube, and on Steemit. I'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye.